So, all right. So, Keith, thanks for joining us again. Again, where this is Keith O'Brien, who wrote the book on Pete Rose that we've been discussing. Book Charlie Hustle: The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Glass Glory Days of Baseball. And we know that the book came out. I think it was last year, but
It was March.
especially yeah, March. So, but especially with the the recent passing of Pete Rose, it kind of really just he kind of came back into the spotlight. We thought this is a great time to get Keith. I know you've done a couple of Zoom calls here and there around SABR, but we thought this would be a great time to maybe get you to do one more and kind of add on to the end of it. But I know, yeah, I think you had something, some presentation to show us. I'll let you kind of take over.
Yeah, well, sure. Well, hey, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I live in New Hampshire these days. While I was born and raised in Cincinnati, I live in New Hampshire. It's a cold, dark New England night. So great night to talk about baseball. So I will share my screen here and we'll talk for a little bit about Pete Rose, about this book, about my research. And I thought tonight, given his recent passing, that I would focus really on how we got here with him. We are still sorting through the wreckage of the Pete Rose story 35 years after his banishment, 6 weeks after his death. I think we're going to be sorting through the wreckage of that story for a long time to come. And there is, sort of a narrative of how we got here that isn't well known. So let's start with where we are right now. I mean, it has been a heck of a year for gambling and sports and scandals. Of course, we had the banishment of Tucupita Marcano last spring, a young prospect for the Pirates and the Padres. On the same day that Tucupita Marcano was banned for wagering on his own games, there was an arrest made in an NBA betting scandal involving Jonte Porter. One of his alleged co-conspirators was trying to flee the country, allegedly at JFK in New York, and was picked up there on the very same day that Tucupita Marcano is banned for life. And while all this is happening, of course, we're still at that time reckoning with the scandal involving Shohei Ohtani and his interpreter, Ippei Mizuhara. As we all know, Shohei would go on to have a just fine year despite this scandal. But I will say, as a journalist and as a historian, I think there are some pretty interesting holes in this story that we as Americans, we as baseball fans, seem all too willing to look past. So this is the world that we're living in today. A world where we are going to, this year in 2024, set a new record for legalized sports wagering here in America. We're going to legally wager this year over $120 billion on sports. Just to put that in perspective, if you were to pool that money, if we were to pool that money at $120 billion instead of wagering it, we would have enough money to buy every single Major League Baseball team and still have about $40 billion jangling around in our pockets. It's an enormous sum of money. It has fundamentally changed how we consume sports. It's fundamentally changed how we talk about sports. I think, frankly, it's changing American culture. And so, I think there are a lot of reasons for why I wrote this book. I'm a Cincinnatian, born and raised. I believed that I could tell this story in a way no one else could. I thought I could get access in a way that no one else had. And I do think I did all of that. But, beyond that, what better time to revisit the story of one of our most notorious gamblers than right now? And so, that's why I dove into this book. And, when you start researching the story of Pete Rose, in the way that I did, I wanted to tell the whole story, the rise and the fall, the good and the bad, and just lay that story out there for readers, for baseball fans. Let people come to their own conclusions. And one thing I realized is that Pete Rose's gambling problems, which will ultimately be his undoing, don't begin, in the 1980s. It doesn't begin in 1989 when he gets himself in trouble. It begins all the way at the start, when Pete Rose was a boy growing up on the west side of Cincinnati. This is a photograph of Pete Rose on his city champion 15 and under baseball team on the west side. And really until this book, this photograph had never really seen the light of day. I love this photo for lots of reasons. One of them is that even now, right here, when he's 15 years old, things are happening in his life, or have already happened in his life, that's going to put him on the path for what will happen later. And really, it begins with his father. Pete Rose's father, Harry Francis Rose, better known as Big Pete, was a prominent semi-pro athlete on the west side of Cincinnati in the 1930s and 40s. He was a football player primarily, and a really good one. And this is at a time when there was no professional football team in Cincinnati, so semi-pro was as far as Big Pete could go. And so, from the moment his son is born, he is fixated on his success as an athlete. And he will take him, Big Pete will, to some of these games. This is Big Pete's West Side semi-pro team in the fall of 1947. Big Pete is all the way over there on the right, number 68, with his left elbow on his knee. Little Pete is right there in the middle. You can get a better shot of them here, the boy and the father. And one thing that happened at these games that I think is important is that these men were often wagering on the outcomes. They placed bets with each other in the parking lots before the games. They exchanged cash in the parking lot after the game. And so, Pete is seen gambling there. He is, in a lot of ways, gambling just down the hill from his house, outside this tavern called Schulte's. This was on River Road in Anderson Ferry. Schulte's was about 7 miles straight downriver from downtown Cincinnati. Pete Rose's house, childhood home, would have been just up the hill there in the trees. By the time Pete was 15 years old in that photograph I showed you a minute ago, I mean, he could have hit Schulte's by throwing a baseball at it. That's how close he lived to Schulte's. And the children like to gather outside the brick walls of this tavern, and play a game that they called lagging pennies. What many of us would have called pitching pennies. A game where closest to the wall won, and you'd take the loser's penny and stick it in your pocket. Pete Rose was very good at lagging pennies. And lastly, I find notable this. I got access to Pete Rose for this book, 27 hours of recorded interviews with him. And I found it notable that he told me that his fondest memories of his childhood on the West Side, wasn't playing baseball himself. It was going to the racetrack in Cincinnati, going to River Downs on the weekends with his father, and cheering on his daddy's horse to win. So this is the culture from which Pete Rose comes on the West Side. This is the culture he brings with him into the major leagues in 1963, when he is a rookie and a prominent rookie for his hometown team, the Cincinnati Reds. And so, what does Pete do when he makes the big club and has a little bit of money in his pocket? Well, he goes right back out to that racetrack, River Downs. He spent a lot of time there in the summer of 1963. In fact, Pete Rose would meet his first wife there, Carolyn. They would marry on the west side of Cincinnati at St. William's Church in January 1964, just before Pete's second season begins. Pete would say later that Carolyn understood that he needed to go to the racetrack, that was part of who he was. But you know who didn't understand that? Cincinnati Reds fans didn't. By the late 1960s, people were calling the front office of the Cincinnati Reds to complain that Pete Rose was spending too much time at River Downs. And I love that quote there from Pete. I guess they expected me to stay home and cut the grass. He's defiant that this is who he is. And based on my reporting, by the late 1960s, or certainly by 1970, he is going to the racetrack with this man here. This man's name was Alphonse Herman Esselman. He was a prominent West Sider, a good-looking man, well-dressed, drove nice cars, outfitted his wife with the finest furs, sent his children to parochial schools, and was a member of the Western Hills Country Club, where Al Esselman's wife played in the ladies' golf league. But this life that Al Esselman had carved out for himself wasn't financed by the bar he owned or the used car dealership that he owned on the West Side. It was financed by gambling. This is part of Al Esselman's FBI internal file. By 1961, when Pete Rose is in the minor leagues, they're already following Alphonse Esselman everywhere. As this record notes, he was one of the biggest gamblers in the greater Cincinnati area. And time and again, in the 1960s and into the 1970s, Al Esselman is indicted for his gambling schemes. Gambling schemes at times involving tens of thousands of dollars. And so he's a known quantity in Cincinnati. A known quantity who's making headlines again and again and again for his gambling. This is one of Pete Rose's running buddies at River Downs on the West Side. And to be fair to Pete for a moment, it wasn't just like it was Pete Rose and Al Esselman hanging out there. At times, beat writers for the Cincinnati Reds, beat writers for the local newspapers, would be hanging out with Al Esselman and Pete Rose too, betting on the horses at River Downs. But sometime around 1970, Pete Rose begins to use Al Esselman's services as a bookie, betting on football and basketball. As Pete would tell me, the games were more interesting if you had a little bit of money on them. So Al Esselman, a prominent figure in Pete Rose's life, or at least in the shadows of his life. But he wasn't the only one. By the mid-1970s, Pete Rose was also running around with this man here. His name was Mario Nunez. He was the maitre d' at the Clubhouse Bar at Tampa Downs down in Florida, just a few miles from the spring training home of the Cincinnati Reds. And, over the years, Pete would explain that, he was just friends with Mario. They were pals. In fact, Pete gave Mario Nunez a nickname that stuck. He called him the Cuban. And he would just say, he liked hanging out with the Cuban. They just seemed to hit it off, as this headline pointed out. But this was more than just a casual friendship. In 1980, when Pete Rose got an invite to come to the Oval Office and meet Jimmy Carter, he brought the Cuban with him. That's how much the Cuban meant to him. And the Cuban wasn't just a running pal of Pete Rose, someone he'd hang out with at the racetrack down in Florida. In the fall of 1975, in the playoffs leading up to that epic World Series between the Cincinnati Reds and the Boston Red Sox, the Cuban is staying at Pete Rose's house in Cincinnati, and he is at the invite of Hall of Fame manager Sparky Anderson hanging out in the clubhouse with the Cincinnati Reds, actually traveling with the team. As Sparky Anderson would say that fall, the Cuban was their good luck charm at a time when Major League Baseball was setting viewership records, television audience records of around the excitement of this epic World Series. Pete Rose is there, Carlton Fisk is there, Bernie Carbo and Johnny Bench are there, and so is the Cuban. But this didn't sit well with everybody. In fact, based on my reporting during that World Series, October 1975, one man is concerned about Pete Rose's off-field relationships, and that man was Johnny Bench. Johnny Bench, of course, is there in that photograph. The other photograph is Curt Gowdy, the longtime voice of baseball for NBC. Curt Gowdy is calling the World Series for NBC, and Gowdy would recall later that while they were at Fenway Park, Johnny Bench approached Gowdy on the field, asking for an intervention of sorts with Pete Rose. The story that Gowdy would tell later was that Johnny was concerned that Pete Rose was hanging out with bad guys. And I believe that Johnny was most likely referencing the Cuban and Al Esselman and others of that ilk. But Johnny wasn't the only one who was concerned. When you do a book like this, of course, you want to talk to all the Hall of Famers. You want to talk to the big names. You want to be able to, share stories of those interviews in a Zoom like this. But what I found is that oftentimes it was the guys closer to the end of the bench that had the better stories and often the better perspectives. And one of those guys I interviewed was Dave Collins. Many of you here tonight will remember Dave Collins. He's a long-time utility player in the major leagues. In fact, 16 seasons. Notably for me, Dave Collins is traded to the Cincinnati Reds before the 1978 season. And I wanted to talk to anyone I could who was around in 1978 because this was a year when Pete was having epic success on the field with his 44-game hit streak. It was also a year when things were starting to unravel for him off the field. Problems in his marriage, problems with mistresses, a child being born out of wedlock. All of these things are happening in 78. So I want to interview anyone I can about this season. And Dave Collins was one of them I spoke to. And he was a great interview for a few reasons. If you look at his career log there, you'll see that he plays his first couple years for the California Angels and the Seattle Mariners. Really bad baseball teams. And then he's traded to the remnants, essentially, of the Big Red Machine. And so Dave Collins is thrilled to be on that bench. And he is a sponge, soaking up knowledge from Johnny Bench and Pete Rose. And Dave Collins tells me that one day that spring of 1978, just before this 44-game hit streak began, Pete Rose was missing at the batting cages. And this was notable because Pete Rose loved the batting cage before the game. He probably loved it actually more than he loved the game itself. He loved hitting. He loved the camaraderie. He loved, just the hangouts around the cage. And so Dave Collins starts asking around, where's Pete? The story that was told that day was that Pete was upstairs in the office of Reds president Dick Wagner, and a high-ranking official from Major League Baseball in New York. And the discussion that day was about his gambling, his relationships to bookies, and his debts to bookies. Indeed, Dick Wagner, the president of the Red, was worried for Pete Rose's safety in 1978 based on these debts. This is 11 years before we, the public, we, the fans, will become aware of these problems. But of course, in 1978, some people already were aware of the problems. They were Pete's closest pals in his inner circle. And I interviewed all of them. In fact, I interviewed 3 different men who would place Pete Rose's bets on baseball. The first was this man here, Tommy Giosa. This is Tommy Giosa's photograph from his senior year at high school in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Tommy was a very talented baseball player, second baseman, just like Pete Rose. To give you a sense of just how hard it is to become a major league player and just how hard it is to become Pete Rose, that senior year in New Bedford, high school, 1976, Tommy Giosa bats over 500. He gets no nibbles from the major leagues, no scholarship offers from major colleges. Tommy has to go play at a community college in nearby Brockton, Mass. And the only great thing that happens in the 2 years while Tommy's in Brockton is that school travels down to Tampa, Florida every spring to play in a tournament at Old Al Lopez Field, the spring training home of the Cincinnati Reds. And Tommy Giosa stays in the same hotel as Pete Rose. And pretty soon, Tommy Giosa is done playing baseball. And all he's doing now is whatever Pete Rose wants him to do. Like a lot of people, Tommy Giosa is sort of sucked in by the gravitational pull of Pete Rose. He will happily wash his Porsches and do his dry cleaning. He will help Pete hide his girlfriends. And yes, he will place his bets with bookies and his bets on baseball. And later, Tommy will make, a grave mistake. when Major League Baseball begins to look into this problem and this scandal. And one by one, people begin to tell the truth, tell what they know. Tommy Giosa refuses to do that. He's too loyal to Pete. He doesn't want to hurt him. And for that loyalty, Tommy Giosa will pay a really awful personal price. Another man I interviewed was this man here, Mike Bertolini, or as Pete called him, Berto. Berto meets Pete because he is a young mover and shaker, Bertolini is, in the new and growing world of sports memorabilia. And in fact, it's Mike Bertolini who has a very early and radical idea. He believes that it would behoove him to pay athletes, say $5,000 or $10,000, for them to sign a lot of memorabilia that he could then flip and sell for even more. And through that idea, through the world of memorabilia, Mike Bertolini and Pete Rose become good friends. And soon, it is Mike Bertolini who is moving up in the world, sucked in by the gravitational pull of Pete Rose, and willing to do anything for his friend. And the last of the men who I interviewed who placed Pete Rose's bets on baseball was Paul Jansen. Paul Jansen was a prominent bodybuilder in Cincinnati, a friend of Tommy Giosa's through Gold's Gym on the north side of Cincinnati. And when Tommy Giosa falls out of favor with Pete Rose and moves away for a time, it is Paul Jansen who begins to fill that role in the winter and spring of 1987 and into 1988. These men have access to a world that everybody in Cincinnati wanted to be a part of in the 1970s and 80s. Lots of people wanted to be part of Pete Rose's world. And it is what these men learn that finally, make it to the offices of Major League Baseball in February 1989. It is at that moment that the incoming commissioner, Bart Giamatti, then the National League president, learns of a rumor that Sports Illustrated is investigating the tip that Pete Rose has been betting on baseball and betting on his own games. Giamatti does in that moment in February 1989 what I think anybody would have done. He and his right-hand man, Fay Vincent, call Pete Rose to New York for a secret meeting in which they ask him point blank, have you been betting on baseball? Based on my reporting, not opinion, my, understanding of the facts. If Pete Rose is honest that day with Giamatti, everything is different. I don't mean to suggest that Pete would not have been punished for his sins. He would have. But I don't think it would have been a punishment that we would be sorting through 35 years later. But of course, Pete Rose doesn't tell Bart Giamatti the truth. He denies the details of this rumor. He says, of course, he hasn't bet on his own games. Of course, he hasn't bet on baseball. As Fay Vincent would tell me later, Pete Rose said, I wouldn't be that stupid. It was believable. When Rose leaves that day, Giamatti, Vincent, they believe him. But because Sports Illustrated is circling and possibly working up a story about what they're finding, Giamatti knows they can't sit around and wait. They got to find out what they don't know. And so it is within just a couple of days of that secret meeting that Bart Giamatti and Fay Vincent get on the phone with John Dowd. John Dowd had no affiliation with Major League Baseball. He was simply a great investigator and a lawyer, and in fact, had done a great deal of work over the years unraveling cases involving corruption. John Dowd's work indeed had put congressmen and mobsters under indictment. He was highly overqualified for the job of investigating Pete Rose, and I say that with respect. And it is John Dowd and a small team of investigators who begin to chase down the truth. And within a matter of just 8 to 10 weeks, Dowd has compiled, what we all now know as the Dowd Report. This was a report about 250 pages in length. More notable was that there were thousands and thousands of pages of exhibits and documents and depositions that were the evidence on which this report was built. And while Dowd and Giamatti, will pay a great price for that work in 1989, as Pete continues to deny what he has done, casting doubts among baseball fans about the truth of this report. What I can tell you is this: the John Dowd report is a stunningly accurate first draft of history, pulled together in an incredibly short period of time under the worst kind of pressure. So, of course, I want to interview all these people for the book. Of course, I want to, go through the Dowd report. More importantly, go through those thousands of pages of exhibits and documents. But I wasn't relying strictly on those things. I was, relying on two other pieces of information that I think reveal a lot about how we got here with Pete Rose. Over the years, these three men, Tommy Giosa, Paul Jansen, Mike Bertolini, I think were vilified at times by the press. Pete was denying he had done anything. The press, took that, ran with it, and at times seemed to blame these men for Pete's problems. To be fair to the press for a moment, each of these men did have legal troubles off the field. In fact, all the people in Pete Rose's inner circle or on the fringes of his inner circle in the mid-1980s did. By 1986, the FBI in Cincinnati was tracking some of these guys. And one by one, they would be picked up by the FBI, and one by one, they would start to turn on each other. And one of the big breakthroughs I made in my research was going back to Ohio, going to the federal courthouse in Cincinnati and then Columbus, tracking down these federal case files involving about a dozen different people, and then ordering these boxes back to the federal courthouse in Columbus. And once I had these boxes, a whole world opened up to me that frankly we had never seen before. As the FBI begins to close in on each of these folks, and as they turn on each other, you can really begin to feel the walls closing in around Pete Rose. In 86, 87, 88, only Pete is blissfully unaware of it. And just as important as those federal court records was a smaller batch of records kept by Mike Bertolini. In the mid-1980s, Pete sometimes had multiple bookies or multiple runners placing his bets. Bertolini and Jansen were both working, frankly, for Rose at the same time. And in 1986, Mike Bertolini kept notes of his wagers and Pete Rose's wagers in a notebook. The notebook is sort of not a complete document. It doesn't run chronological. It's only about 45 pages in length. But a few things are clear from these records, again, from early 1986. The first is this: Pete Rose bet a lot. Anybody who knows anything about gambling, and we all probably know a little bit about it now in a world of legalized gambling, knows that you can't, look at this weekend's slate of NFL games and bet on 12 of them and think that it's going to go well. You look to find the value. You look to find the bargain. You look to find the game that you think you know a little bit about. Pete Rose was betting on, at times, 10, 12 games a day. And in March 1986, he was losing in some weeks $32,000. Just for perspective here, this was at a time when Pete Rose was making about $500,000 as the player manager of the Cincinnati Reds. It's an enormous sum of money. And so what happens coming out of this dreadful March of 1986 where Pete is losing $30,000 a week? Well, based on the notes that Mike Bertolini kept in his notebook, Pete Rose begins betting on baseball. Pete, maintained till the end of his life that he didn't start betting on baseball until the fall of 1986, October 1986. He said he began betting during the NLCS between the Houston Astros and the New York Mets. If that is true, it would have been 2 months after Pete Rose's last at bat as a player. Again, Mike Bertolini's notebook suggests very clearly that it begins sooner, that it begins at a minimum by the spring of 1986. I think the reality of the situation is twofold. One, we're probably never going to know, when Pete Rose's gambling began. I did find it, notable and in fact odd that Pete Rose could recall with crystal clear memory a certain game, a certain moment, a certain at bat. He could recall too with crystal clear clarity how many doubles he hit for the Macon Peaches in 1962. But he maintained that he couldn't really remember when his gambling began on baseball. I find that hard to believe. But when you think of it in the way that I do now, I do think it makes a bit more sense. While he struggled to admit this over the years, I do believe it to be true. Pete Rose was addicted to gambling. He suffered from a gambling addiction. And, while most of us don't know someone like that, I think all of us do know someone who does struggle with addiction, drugs or alcohol. And what do addicts do, when confronted with the truth of their problems, when confronted with the wreckage that those problems have created? They diminish and they deny. And that to me is the tragic story of one of our most iconic players. It is the tragic story of Pete Rose. And I want to thank you guys for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions you all might have.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have some questions to start coming in. Yeah, excellent. I guess the kind of question I wanted to start off with is, so Rose is dead now. So if you're writing this book now, what's kind of I guess the next chapter, the new ending for the book, or does it change at all? I guess I should ask.
The paperback is coming out in the spring of 2025. And so, I just made some changes there for the paperback version. I didn't change much. You mentioned, he talked about his funeral and what he wanted for his funeral. Back when I interviewed him, I certainly updated that whole part of the book right there. I do think what happened last week in Cincinnati with his funeral is, sort of a stunning thing, and a sign of just how much he meant to people. Um, I think the real changes are going to come in the years ahead. I mentioned at the outset of our talk tonight, some of the gambling scandals that have happened here with athletes in 2024. I think that's going to continue. I think we're going to continue to see more gambling scandals involving athletes.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Sooner or later, I think one of these scandals is going to involve a really big name, not a Tucupita
yeah.
Marcano, but a really big name, a future Hall of Famer, let's say. And when that happens in this new gambling world that we live in, I think the rubber's really going to meet the road on how we feel about Rule 21D and the lifetime banishment that Pete Rose was handed 35 years ago.
Yeah, and actually, it's funny when you start off talking about Kuputo again, um, banned. The question that popped out of mind is like, okay, what happens if this is Juan Soto or I don't want to put Freddie Freeman in there, but maybe Freddie Freeman. So what happens if that's the next one they catch? Yeah. So
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great hypothetical question. I know what I think happens. I'd be curious to hear what everybody else thinks. I think when the scandal happens involving the big name, the beloved player, right? So you mentioned a few right there. They're big names and they're beloved and they're future Hall of Famers. And those big names you just mentioned are also good for the game, good for baseball. When the scandal happens involving a person like that, I think most fans, and by most I mean 80% of fans, are going to think that the lifetime banishment is out of step with the reality of the world that we are living in the 2020s, especially if that player does what Pete Rose didn't do. And by that I mean if that player comes forward, admits what he did, admits the darkness of his gambling addiction, falls on the proverbial sword and begs for forgiveness, I find it very hard to believe that that player would be banned for life in the 2020s or beyond.
I have a couple more, but I'll open it up now. See if anybody else had any questions they might want to ask.
Keith, this is Tad Meyer. I met you at Carmichael's.
Hey,
The
Tad.
night
Yeah,
you
good to
came
see you
Louisville.
again.
Met your mom,
Yes.
and that was the night you hit the bestseller list. I don't know if you remember
Oh,
that.
yeah, that's right. Yes.
You had just gotten the news then.
Yes. Yes.
Fantastic book.
Thank you.
Really interesting book, and it's amazing to me how many different opinions there are about Rose and how many different things that raises, like the question of should we look at the character of past Hall of Famers judged by modern day standards and those types of things. But you mentioned addiction. To me, one of the bars that maybe others should have fallen prey to for Rose is idiocy. I mean, the guy had it all, and he just kept making one mistake after another. Even and I think you say this in your book. There was a ray of hope, and he sued somebody, and in a deposition admitted that he'd had sex with an underage girl, and that doomed him. That was kind of his last hope. And when that came out, and it was only because he initiated litigation, the door closed.
Yeah, I mean, a classic miscalculation on his part. As you described it perfectly, Tad. He shot himself in the foot many times over the course of his life, especially the last 35 years. That's another example of it. When he passed recently, I was talking with lots of folks who knew him, and not as a reporter, not as a writer, just, commiserating about someone we had lost in the way, we would all commiserate, say, about Pete Rose. And, I think for a lot of his close friends, the people who loved him, it was sad because he had sort of never gotten right. He never got right with this, and I think that's just one of the sad legacies of Pete Rose.
Did you
Yeah.
find that he ever had like a confidant, somebody he got advice from that may have guided him in the right direction, or was he just making all the calls himself?
He had an attorney by the name of Reuven Katz. Reuven died before my book research began. Most likely, he wouldn't have talked to me anyway. I do think Reuven was trying to set him on the right path. I do know that his lawyers tried in 1989. I do think, unfortunately, like a lot of big stars, and we've seen this in lots of walks of life, lots of different businesses and cultures and slices of life. Sometimes with big stars, you're surrounded with the folks who are going to say the thing you want them to say. John Dowd told me and has told others before that, in the summer of 1989, someone needed to take Rose by the collar and shake him and tell him it was over. It was over. And he needed at that point to come clean and broker the best deal he could make. And he couldn't do it. And, I asked him about that. I tried to understand, why he couldn't do it. And I'm really grateful that I got the access to him that I did, because I feel like I understood things that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And this is one of them. I really do think that Pete Rose succeeds as a player and becomes an iconic player and fails as a man for the same exact reasons, like those same qualities that make him great on the field. That fury that he plays with, his refusal to be vulnerable, his unwillingness to bend, his eternal optimism, all those things are real, and they make him a great player. But the same qualities, like his fury that he approaches life with, his refusal to be vulnerable, his unwillingness to ever appear weak, and this eternal optimism that he will prevail, are the same reasons why he's gonna get himself in trouble off the field and not do the thing he should have done in 1989, which is just tell the truth and ask for help.
See, Karen, you got a question?
I have a question about how much of your research was just swimming in rumors.
I'll say this about this book. This is the first story, whether it's a long magazine piece or a book. This is the first story I've ever reported, really, where the people in the room, the witnesses to the event, often have wildly conflicting versions of how it went down. And so, I didn't peddle in rumors here. I would chase rumors to try to find out if they were true and report them if they were true. There was a lot that I, left out of the book entirely. But the big challenge was parsing fact from fiction when you're interviewing three people who were at the same thing or saw the same play or have the same argument, and trying to figure out which version of this is the closest to the truth. That was the hardest thing to do here.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it was.
Well, I had one of our members, he couldn't make the call tonight, but he did want me to pass along a question because he knew you grew up in Cincinnati, and he was kind of interested to see, what your, I guess, as a child or a boy growing up in Cincinnati, what your impressions of Rose were, and then what kind of, how those change as you work on the book at all.
So, I'm born and raised in Cincinnati, born in 1973. So I'm too young to remember the Big Red Machine years. I'm raised on the story of those years. My first baseball memory involving the Reds is Johnny Bench's last season. So 1983. I remember, of course, when everything after that, Rose being traded back, the hit record, and the scandal to follow. I remember all of that. I feel like this is true, for much of, the Midwest, and much of middle America. I mean, Pete Rose was the wallpaper of our lives in Cincinnati in those years. He was literally the wallpaper of my room. I had that classic poster of Pete Rose with the bubble letters that said Pete on it. I had that, on the wall of my childhood bedroom. So, he's an icon. He's a hero. And, one thing that I felt in my core was that in the last 35 years, while he made mistake after mistake off the field, I think we forgot why we ever cared about him in the first place. And I mean, even baseball fans, even Cincinnatians, I think we forgot. And so, one of the things I wanted to do was go back and reconstruct that, remind people why he mattered, essentially bring him to the mountaintop again, because he was once on the mountaintop of American life. And then by his own choices, his own decisions, he's going to tumble off. So, that was my backdrop coming into the research. And, I'll say for the most part, nothing radically changed, in the time that I got to know him. I do think I just have a deeper appreciation of all the aspects of his life, the high and the low, the love that he engendered in people, but also the pain that he caused for a lot of people. And, on a personal level, over the years as a journalist, I've been fortunate enough to cover big stories and meet lots of people, famous people, etc. That doesn't really faze me. But I will say, on the first day that I met Pete Rose in person, we had already been doing interviews on the phone for many, many hours, and many, many days. And now I was in Las Vegas for 3 days of in-person interviews for like 5 hours a day. And, Rose was picking me up at my hotel. And, one thing you have to know about Pete Rose was the core tenet of hustle was being on time. It was very important for him. And I knew that at this point. And so I made sure that I was sitting on the little bench outside my chain hotel, like 15 minutes before he was supposed to pick me up. And I'm glad I did, because about 7 minutes before our appointed time, Pete Rose comes rolling around the corner in a two-tone black and cream Rolls Royce. And, if there was a moment where I sort of slipped back into the body of my 12-year-old self, it was when I opened the door of that Rolls Royce, slid into that passenger seat, and there was Pete Rose in that white all white Reds ball cap that he always wore in his final years. And it was like, all right, I guess we're doing this now. I guess I'm really here.
Why don't we, so we got a couple minutes left. See if anybody else have any questions. So, hey, Brian, what's going on?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Hey.
Hi, Keith.
Hey, Brian.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier that you think that if there's a scandal with a beloved player of today involved with gambling, that Major League Baseball might have to rethink its stance on gambling and betting and on the lifetime ban associated with Rule 21. But it seems to me, though, that the game itself is kind of based on fair play and being on an up and up. Pardon me.
And no problem.
So, how do you envision if that scenario does happen? If that were to happen, how would Major League Baseball, amend Rule 21? Because it seems like such a foundational concept in the game itself, and how it how Major League Baseball regulates itself, how the players regulate themselves. I mean, I know this is hypothetical, but I mean, how do you envision that happening if that Rubicon were to be crossed?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a great hypothetical conversation, and I'd love anybody else's input on this too. Here's how I think it would go down. And I want to be clear. I do not condone an athlete betting on his or her own games. It is as you just used the phrase cross the Rubicon. You're absolutely right. One thing that we have to believe as fans is that when we get off this Zoom tonight and maybe, tune into the Commanders Eagles game or whatever, we have to believe that what we're seeing is real. And if it ever gets to a point in any sport where we as fans believe that what we're seeing might not be real, well, then it's just, WWE, it's just professional wrestling and it's over.